My mother-in-law cornered me at every family dinner, her emerald necklace glinting as she leaned in. "No parents, no pedigree, no jewels," she'd whisper loud enough for the table to hear. "Tell me, dear, when he trades you in, where will an orphan go?" I'd just smile and pass the wine, watching her lips purple with each sip. "Tell everyone about your parents, dear," Evelyn commanded during the charity auction, her emerald necklace glinting under the ballroom lights. The microphone was still live from the previous speaker, and my stammered confession of being abandoned at Sacred Heart Children's Home echoed through speakers to 300 of the city's most influential families. She smiled like a cat with fresh cream. That humiliation happened 3 months ago, but the memory still burned fresh every Sunday when I sat at her mahogany dining table. Tonight was no different. The same crystal glasses, the same suffocating formality, the same calculating cruelty disguised as family tradition. I watched Evelyn adjust her emerald necklace for what had to be the 15th time since we'd sat down. She always did this before launching into one of her performances, fingers dancing across those green stones like a pianist preparing for a concert. The chandelier light caught each facet, sending tiny rainbows across the pristine white tablecloth. David's sister Emma pushed her roast beef around her plate, already sensing what was coming. His brother Tom had perfected the art of eating without making eye contact, his jaw working mechanically as he chewed. "I had lunch with Margaret Pemberton today," Evelyn began, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant someone was about to be dissected. "Her daughter just announced her engagement to the Morrison boy. You know, the Morrisons' 5th-generation timber money." Margaret was absolutely glowing as she told me about the wedding plans. "Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories of resilience and justice. If you believe that kindness should triumph over cruelty, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds." She paused to sip her wine, letting the anticipation build. This was theater, and Evelyn was always the star. Of course, Margaret mentioned how wonderful it must be to have a daughter who truly understands family legacy. Someone who can trace her bloodline back to the founding families of Charleston. Someone who appreciates the weight of inherited responsibility. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. I gripped my wine glass tighter, feeling the familiar knot form in my stomach. Around the table, David's extended family cousins visiting from Atlanta, elderly Aunt Ruth from Savannah, the perpetually disapproving Uncle Charles, all pretended to focus on their dinner while absorbing every poisonous word. "It made me think," Evelyn continued, her pale blue eyes finding mine across the table, "about how different families handle heritage. Some people are fortunate enough to inherit not just wealth but history. Stories passed down through generations. Family Bibles with names dating back centuries. Jewelry that carries the love and dreams of great-grandmothers." Her fingers found the emerald pendant at the center of her necklace, holding it up to catch the light. The gesture was practiced, deliberate. She'd performed it countless times over the years, always with the same effect. Conversations stopped. Eyes focused. The room held its breath. "These emeralds," she said, her voice taking on a reverent quality, "belonged to my grandmother, Eleanor Blackwood. She wore them to her presentation at court in London in 1898. Can you imagine? A girl from Charleston standing before Queen Victoria herself, representing not just her family but her entire social class. I'd heard this story so many times I could recite it word for word. But tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the way David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when his mother's voice took on that dreamy, superior tone. Maybe it was how Emma's wine glass trembled slightly in her grip, betraying her discomfort with the family performance. Or maybe it was simply that I'd finally reached my limit for accepting cruelty disguised as tradition. "My mother wore them to her wedding in 1923, Evelyn continued, warming to her favorite subject. The Charleston Post and Courier called it the social event of the decade. 700 guests, all from the finest families. My father said he fell in love with her the moment he saw her walking down that aisle, these emeralds catching the light from the cathedral windows. She turned the pendant slightly, creating new patterns of reflected light across the dining room walls. And someday when I'm gone, they'll pass to the next generation. To someone who understands their significance. Someone who appreciates the responsibility that comes with wearing 3 generations of family history." The implication was clear as mountain air. Not me. Never me. I was the interloper, the girl with no past who'd somehow convinced their golden son to marry her. No matter how many years I sat at this table, no matter how many Sunday dinners I endured, I would always be the outsider looking in. David cleared his throat softly. Mother, perhaps we could talk about something else. Sarah's been working so hard on expanding her catering business. Maybe she could tell everyone about the Morrison wedding she's handling next month. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Evelyn's smile became arctic. Working, she repeated as if the word tasted bitter. Yes, well, I suppose some people need to keep themselves busy. Though I've always believed that a woman's highest calling is creating a proper home for her family. Building something that lasts. Something with permanence. Uncle Charles nodded approvingly from his end of the table. Quite right, Evelyn. In my day, ladies understood their proper role in society. None of this modern nonsense about careers and independence. Oh, but Charles, Aunt Ruth chimed in with false sweetness, surely you don't object to women having little hobbies? As long as they don't interfere with family obligations, of course. The word hobbies hit me harder than an actual slap. My catering business. Something I'd built from nothing, something that employed 3 people and supported dozens of local suppliers, reduced to a hobby. A cute little distraction for the woman who would never be good enough to inherit real responsibility. I think Sarah's business is wonderful, Emma said quietly, her first words of the evening. The food at David's birthday party was absolutely delicious. Everyone kept asking for her card. Evelyn's smile turned predatory. How sweet of you to say, Emma. Though I do hope Sarah understands that certain standards must be maintained when representing the Blackwood name. We wouldn't want any unfortunate incidents that might reflect poorly on the family reputation. The words were carefully chosen, designed to sound supportive while delivering maximum damage. In Evelyn's world, my success was always qualified, always conditional, always subject to her approval and the family's reputation. I set down my wine glass with deliberate care, the crystal making a soft chime against the mahogany table. Every eye in the room focused on me, sensing the shift in atmosphere. For 12 years, I'd absorbed these attacks with grace and silence. For 12 years, I'd played the role of the grateful outsider, thankful to be included even as I was systematically excluded. But tonight something had changed. Maybe it was the memory of that charity auction humiliation, still fresh enough to sting. Maybe it was the realization that no amount of patience or kindness would ever earn me acceptance from this woman. Or maybe it was simply that I'd finally stopped caring about keeping the peace. You're absolutely right, Evelyn, I said, my voice steady and clear. Standards are incredibly important. Especially when it comes to family legacy and inherited responsibility. She blinked, caught off guard by my agreement. Around the table, conversations stopped mid-sentence as everyone registered the subtle change in my tone. I've been thinking a lot lately about what really matters, I continued, meeting her gaze directly. About the difference between things that are inherited and things that are earned. About which kind of legacy actually has value. The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Emma leaned forward slightly, her eyes wide with anticipation. Even Uncle Charles stopped chewing, sensing that something significant was happening. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her emerald pendant, knuckles white with tension. I'm not sure I follow your meaning, dear. Don't you? I asked, my smile as sweet as poisoned honey. I suppose some things become clearer with time. And patience. And the right kind of education. I stood slowly, smoothing my napkin before placing it beside my plate. The gesture was casual, unhurried, but everyone in the room felt its significance. For the first time in 12 years I was ending a Sunday dinner on my own terms. Thank you for another lovely evening, I said, my voice carrying just enough emphasis to make it clear that lovely meant something entirely different than what it usually did. I'm sure next week will be even more illuminating. As I walked toward the kitchen to help Maria with the dishes, I caught my reflection in the antique mirror hanging beside the doorway. For the first time in years, I didn't see a victim looking back at me. I saw a woman who'd finally stopped playing defense and was ready to learn the rules of offense. The Blackwood family secrets were about to meet someone who understood the true value of patience, observation, and the power of being consistently underestimated. Evelyn's emerald necklace might represent 3 generations of inherited privilege, But I was about to show her what the fourth generation could accomplish when it stopped asking for permission and started taking what it deserved. The kitchen in our small apartment became my sanctuary that Tuesday morning, flour dusting every surface as I kneaded dough for what would become my signature rosemary focaccia. Maria arrived at 6:30 sharp, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her apron already tied around her waist. She'd been working with me for 8 months now, and I'd never seen anyone handle delicate pastry work with such gentle precision. "Mrs. Sarah, the Henderson order is ready for pickup," she said, sliding a tray of miniature quiches from the oven. 20 dozen just like she requested. I smiled, wiping my hands on my apron. Mrs. Henderson's daughter's bridal shower had been our biggest booking yet, a breakthrough into Charleston's exclusive social circle that I'd been trying to crack for years. The fact that she'd chosen delicate dishes over the established caterers her friends typically used felt like validation of everything I'd been working toward. The business had started small, almost accidentally. David's colleague had tasted my salmon Wellington at a dinner party and asked if I'd cater his wife's book club meeting. One event led to another, word spreading through networks I hadn't even known existed. Soon my phone was ringing with requests from garden societies, charity committees, and birthday celebrations throughout the county. "Look at this," I said, showing Maria the appointment book that had once been frustratingly empty. "We're booked solid through the end of October. The Riverside Women's Club wants us to handle their annual luncheon next month. That's 200 people, Maria. 200. Her smile was radiant. As a single mother working 2 jobs to support her twin daughters, this steady income meant everything to her. "My girls want to know if they can help with the cookies next weekend," she said. "They practice icing techniques on graham crackers at home." The thought of Maria's 8-year-old daughters carefully decorating sugar cookies made my heart swell. This business wasn't just about food, it was about creating opportunities, building something meaningful from nothing. Every successful event proved that I could accomplish something significant without inheriting it or marrying into it. The phone rang as we were packaging the Henderson order. I answered with my professional voice, the one I'd practiced until it sounded confident and capable. "Mrs. Patterson?" I said, recognizing the caller immediately. "Yes, I have you down for the garden party this Saturday. Shrimp salad, tea sandwiches and lavender shortbread, serving for 40 guests." The pause on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. When Mrs. Patterson finally spoke, her voice sounded strained, almost apologetic. "I'm terribly sorry, Sarah, but we need to postpone the event indefinitely. Family emergency. You understand." My stomach dropped. "Of course, I hope everything works out. Should we reschedule for next month?" "Oh well, we're not sure about timing right now. Perhaps it's best if we call you when things settle down." The dial tone buzzed in my ear as I stared at the phone, trying to process what had just happened. Maria looked up from her packaging, concern creasing her features. "Problem with Saturday?" "Cancellation," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Family emergency." But something felt wrong. Mrs. Patterson's voice had been too careful, too rehearsed. In my experience, real emergencies came with raw emotion, scattered thoughts, genuine distress. This had sounded like someone reading from a script. 3 days later, the Riverside Women's Club called with their own cancellation. Budget concerns, they said. The economy was tight and they'd decided to handle refreshments internally this year. My hands trembled as I crossed their name off the booking calendar, watching 2 weeks of planning and a month's worth of rent disappear with a few apologetic sentences. "This doesn't make sense," Maria said, studying the cancelled orders spread across our small kitchen table. "Mrs. Patterson's husband just bought a new boat. I saw it at the marina last weekend. And the Women's Club spent $15,000 on their spring fundraiser decorations alone." The pattern became impossible to ignore over the next week. Mrs. Whitman's charity luncheon was suddenly postponed due to scheduling conflicts. The Morrison family's anniversary celebration was cancelled when they decided on a more intimate gathering. Each conversation followed the same script: polite apologies, vague excuses and firm refusals to reschedule. By Friday we'd lost 4 major bookings representing nearly 3 months of income. I sat surrounded by ingredients I'd already purchased, deposit checks I'd already spent, and the crushing realization that someone was systematically destroying my business. "Maybe we should diversify," Maria suggested gently. "Target younger clients, businesses instead of social clubs." People who don't all know each other. But I knew these cancellations weren't coincidental. The timing was too precise, the excuses too similar. Someone with influence in Charleston's social circles was spreading poison about my business, and I had a sick feeling I knew exactly who that someone was. The truth revealed itself on a Wednesday afternoon when I was delivering leftover pastries to the downtown food bank. The community center shared a wall with their main meeting room, and as I arranged Danish rolls in their kitchen, I heard a familiar laugh through the thin partition. "Well, Martha, you certainly don't want to risk food poisoning at your daughter's wedding," Evelyn's voice carried clearly through the adjoining wall. "I heard from a very reliable source that Sarah's little catering venture has some serious hygiene issues. Health department concerns, that sort of thing." My blood turned to ice. I pressed closer to the wall, hardly breathing as Evelyn continued her performance. Of course, I'd never say anything publicly, family loyalty and all that. But between friends, I thought you should know. Margaret Sinclair's daughter runs a lovely catering business. Very established, very proper standards. I could give you her number. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes. Evelyn systematically destroying my reputation with carefully crafted lies delivered in concerned, helpful tones. By the time I heard chairs scraping and goodbyes being exchanged, I was shaking with rage and disbelief. That evening I confronted David in our living room, laying out every cancelled booking and explaining exactly what I'd overheard. His face cycled through emotions, surprise, discomfort, and finally that maddening neutral expression he wore whenever his mother's behavior became indefensible. "Are you absolutely certain it was Mother?" he asked, already looking for ways to doubt what I'd told him. "Maybe you misunderstood the conversation." "David, I heard her mention specific clients by name. She's been spreading lies about health department issues and food poisoning. She's destroying my business deliberately." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his retreat into willful blindness. "Mother can be protective of the family reputation. Maybe she's just concerned about you taking on too much." "She's sabotaging me," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "She's calling my clients and lying about hygiene issues. She's recommending competitors and undermining everything I've built. Perhaps," he said slowly, "this is a sign that you should consider scaling back anyway. The business has been consuming so much of your time. Maybe Mother has a point about focusing more on family obligations." The betrayal hit me harder than any of Evelyn's direct attacks ever had. My own husband, the man who'd promised to support my dreams, was taking his mother's side even when presented with evidence of her deliberate cruelty. But that night, as I lay awake planning how to rebuild what Evelyn had tried to destroy, I realized she'd made a crucial mistake. By forcing me to look beyond her social circle for clients, she'd inadvertently freed me from caring about her approval or acceptance. The next morning, I started making calls to young professionals, tech startups, and family-owned businesses that valued quality over connections. Maria and I worked harder than ever, and slowly, painfully, we began building something stronger than what we'd lost. Evelyn had tried to put me back in my place, to prove that women like me shouldn't aspire beyond their assigned roles. What she'd actually done was give me the motivation to stop playing by her rules entirely. Every successful event with my new clients was a small victory, proof that my worth wasn't dependent on her approval. The war wasn't over, it was just beginning. The war was just beginning, but I had no idea how dramatically the battlefield was about to shift. David's phone rang at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning, jolting us both from sleep. His voice was groggy as he answered, but I watched his face transform from confusion to shock to something resembling grief. "What do you mean, pancreatic cancer?" he said, sitting up straighter in bed. "How long has she known?" I knew before he hung up that the caller was discussing Margaret Blackwood, Evelyn's elderly aunt who lived alone in the Victorian mansion overlooking the Ashley River. Margaret was 83, sharp as a tack despite her age, and the current keeper of the family's most prized possession, those emeralds that Evelyn adjusted so lovingly at every family gathering. 6 months, David said after ending the call. "Maybe less. The doctors say it's aggressive." I expected Evelyn to be at Margaret's bedside within the hour. After all, she'd spent years cultivating their relationship, always mentioning her dear Aunt Margaret at social functions, always making sure everyone knew about the family connection and the inevitable inheritance. Instead, when David called his mother with the news, her response was breathtakingly callous. Oh, how dreadful. Evelyn sighed through the phone, her voice carrying that theatrical quality she used when discussing unpleasant topics. I'm simply too emotionally fragile to handle sickness, David. You know how these things affect me. Perhaps we should hire a proper nurse. David's jaw tightened as he listened to his mother's excuses. She was too busy with the garden club's spring fundraiser. The bridge tournament at the country club needed her attention. Someone had to maintain normalcy during this difficult time, and clearly that someone was her. What about visiting her? David pressed. She's going to be frightened and alone. Well, of course I'll visit, Evelyn replied airily. When things settle down. When I can handle it emotionally. Right now, I think it's best if we give her space to process the diagnosis. The conversation lasted another 5 minutes, but I stopped listening. Something cold and determined was crystallizing in my chest as I realized that Margaret Blackwood, the woman Evelyn had been circling like a vulture for years, was going to die alone while her only living relative attended social functions. That afternoon, I drove to Margaret's house without telling anyone where I was going. The Victorian mansion sat on 2 acres of overgrown gardens, its wraparound porch sagging slightly under the weight of decades and neglect. Paint peeled from the shutters and several windows were covered with newspapers from the inside. Margaret answered the door herself, moving slowly but with dignity intact. She was smaller than I remembered from family gatherings, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun that emphasized the elegant bones of her face. When she saw me standing on her porch with a basket of homemade soup and fresh bread, her pale blue eyes filled with tears. "Sarah," she whispered as if my name was a prayer. "You came." The house smelled of old roses and loneliness, with undertones of the medications that now dominated Margaret's daily routine. Family photographs covered every surface, wedding pictures from the 1940s, birthday parties from decades past, Christmas mornings when the house had been full of laughter and children. "You don't have to stay," Margaret said as I helped her settle into her favorite armchair beside the fireplace. "I know you must be busy with your catering business. Evelyn mentioned you were having some difficulties." The casual cruelty of that comment, delivered without malice by Margaret herself, revealed how thoroughly Evelyn had poisoned even this conversation. But I could see the hope in Margaret's eyes, the desperate longing for companionship that she was trying so hard to hide. "I have time," I said simply. "Maria can handle the business for a while. I'd like to stay if you'll let me." Over the following weeks, I split my time between Margaret's bedside and my kitchen, preparing soft foods she could tolerate and sitting with her during the long afternoons when pain made sleep impossible. As her strength faded, something unexpected happened. Her filters began disappearing, revealing truths she'd kept hidden for decades. "Evelyn called yesterday," Margaret mentioned during our second week together, her voice weak but laced with bitter amusement. "First time in 6 months, and you know what she asked about? Whether I'd updated my will recently. Not how I was feeling, not whether I needed anything. Just the will." I continued spooning chicken broth into Margaret's mouth, letting her talk without judgment or interruption. "She's been doing it for years," Margaret continued. "Visiting just often enough to maintain appearances, always complimenting that necklace when she thinks I'm not paying attention. She doesn't know I see right through her performance." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. 30 years I've been watching her circle this house like a hungry bird. Never once has she asked about my pain or brought me soup when I was sick. But she remembers every birthday, every Christmas, always with a little gift and a big smile. Insurance, you see. Making sure she stays in the will. These revelations should have brought me satisfaction. Proof that I wasn't the only one who saw through Evelyn's calculated kindness. Instead, they filled me with sadness for Margaret's isolation and clarity about just how manipulative my mother-in-law truly was. The real truth emerged during Margaret's 3rd week under my care. We were looking through old photo albums, her fingers moving slowly across pictures from happier times. When she reached a particular page, her hand stopped completely, hovering over a photograph of a handsome young man in a Navy uniform. "That's James," she said softly, her voice carrying decades of buried pain. "Lieutenant James Morrison. We were supposed to marry in June of 1962. I leaned closer, studying the photograph. James had kind eyes and a genuine smile, the sort of man who looked like he'd build a good life with the woman he loved. "What happened?" I asked gently. Margaret's laugh was bitter as autumn wind. Evelyn happened. She was 22, beautiful, and she decided she wanted what I had. Started showing up at all the places James and I went together. The officers' club, the church social events, the family picnics. Always dressed perfectly, always charming, always finding reasons to touch his arm or laugh at his jokes. The story unfolded like pages from a tragic novel. Evelyn had spread whispers about Margaret's faithfulness, suggesting she'd been seen with other men while James was deployed. She'd orchestrated situations where James would find her crying, claiming Margaret had been cruel to her. She'd played the victim while systematically destroying Margaret's relationship from the inside. He broke our engagement 2 weeks before the wedding, Margaret whispered. Said he couldn't marry someone he couldn't trust. Married Evelyn 6 months later, never knowing the lies she'd told. Margaret closed the photo album with shaking hands. She stole my happiness, Sarah. Took the only man I ever loved and destroyed my chance at the life I'd dreamed of. And now she sits in my living room, complimenting my jewelry and expecting to inherit everything I have left. The weight of this revelation settled over me like a heavy blanket. Evelyn's cruelty wasn't just recent behavior. It was a lifelong pattern of taking what she wanted regardless of who got hurt. 3 days before Margaret died, she called me to her bedside with unusual urgency. Her grip was surprisingly strong as she pulled me close, her breath shallow but her eyes completely alert. "The emeralds," she whispered, glancing toward the jewelry box on her dresser. "Sarah, I need to tell you something about those emeralds." My heart began beating faster, sensing the importance of whatever she was about to reveal. "They're not real," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "I sold the genuine ones in 1963, right after James married Evelyn. Used the money to pay for my sister Catherine's cancer treatment. Had perfect replicas made, paste and glass, but so expertly crafted that even a jeweler would need special testing to tell the difference." She pressed a small velvet pouch into my hands, her fingers cold but determined. "Everything's in there. The receipts from when I sold the real emeralds, the bill from the jewelry maker who created the copies, all of it. Evelyn has been wearing costume jewelry for 30 years, believing she was displaying priceless family heirlooms." Margaret's laugh was weak but triumphant. "She destroyed my life for nothing, Sarah. Absolutely nothing. And she doesn't even know it." Margaret died on a Sunday morning in October, her hand growing cold in mine as her breathing simply stopped. There was no struggle, no dramatic final words, just a gentle release that felt almost peaceful after weeks of watching her fight pain with quiet dignity. I closed her eyes and sat with her for another hour, holding her hand and listening to the grandfather clock tick in the hallway, marking time in a house that would never hear her laughter again. The funeral arrangements fell to me, a responsibility Margaret had specifically requested in a handwritten note she'd pressed into my hands the week before. "You understand ceremony," she'd written in her shaky script. "Evelyn understands theater. There's a difference." I organized a simple service at St. Michael's Episcopal Church, the same sanctuary where Margaret's parents had been married in 1895. The gathering was smaller than I'd expected but more meaningful than any elaborate production could have been. Mrs. Henley from next door came with tears streaming down her cheeks, sharing stories of how Margaret had brought her soup during her own cancer treatment 5 years earlier. 3 nurses from Charleston General Hospital attended, remembering Margaret's weekly visits to the children's ward where she'd read stories and brought homemade cookies for 30 years. David's cousin Paul drove down from Virginia with his wife, looking genuinely grieved as he spoke about childhood summers spent in Margaret's garden, learning to catch fireflies in mason jars. Even old Mr. Rutledge from the corner house came, leaning heavily on his walker to pay respects to a woman who'd checked on him every week since his wife died. Evelyn arrived 20 minutes late, her entrance carefully choreographed for maximum impact. She wore a black Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, paired with pearl earrings and that inevitable emerald necklace catching the morning light streaming through stained glass windows. Her makeup was flawless, her hair professionally styled, her grief performance worthy of an Academy Award. "I'm so sorry," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear as she settled into the front pew. The florist needed last-minute approval for the arrangements. Margaret would have wanted everything perfect. I watched her dab at completely dry eyes with a lace handkerchief while her gaze swept the small congregation, clearly cataloging who was present and calculating what they might know about Margaret's estate. When the minister asked if anyone wanted to share memories, Evelyn rose gracefully and delivered a touching tribute about dear Aunt Margaret's generous spirit and family devotion that would have been moving if I hadn't spent the last 6 weeks witnessing Margaret's actual isolation. After the service, as we stood beside Margaret's grave in the old section of Magnolia Cemetery, Evelyn transformed. The theatrical grief evaporated, replaced by barely contained excitement that she tried to disguise as dignified anticipation. She kept glancing at her watch, checking her phone, and whispering to David's sister Emma about handling the legal details efficiently. The change became even more pronounced over the following days. Evelyn's entire demeanor shifted from mourning relative to expectant heiress, and she made no effort to hide her calculations. She appeared at my door Tuesday afternoon with a measuring tape and a notebook, claiming she needed to assess Margaret's antiques for proper insurance purposes. "These Persian rugs are museum quality," she announced, running her hands over Margaret's faded living room carpet. "And this furniture, all original Victorian pieces. The estate sale alone should bring substantial returns." She moved through Margaret's house like a general surveying conquered territory, making notes about which pieces would fit in her own home and which would need professional appraisal. When I mentioned that the will hadn't been read yet, she waved dismissively. "Oh, formalities," she said. Margaret and I discussed her intentions many times over the years. She understood the importance of keeping family treasures in proper hands. By Thursday, Evelyn's confidence had reached breathtaking heights. She called 3 jewelry stores to schedule appraisals for insurance purposes on her recently inherited emeralds. She contacted an interior decorator about properly displaying newly acquired antiques. Most telling of all, she began dropping hints about my future living arrangements. "Of course, you'll want to find a place that better suits your current circumstances," she suggested over dinner at David's house. "Once I inherit Margaret's responsibilities, I'll need space for entertaining. The Victorian mansion will require someone who understands proper hospitality standards." The message was clear. With Margaret's fortune behind her, Evelyn would finally have the power to remove me from her son's life entirely. She was already planning my exile, counting inheritance money that hadn't been awarded yet. Attorney Harrison Mills scheduled the will reading for the following Monday, but not before requesting several preliminary meetings that struck me as unusually formal. He asked detailed questions about my relationship with Margaret, my understanding of estate law, and my plans for the future. His demeanor was professional but oddly knowing, as if he was preparing me for something specific. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said during our final private meeting, "I hope you understand that Margaret was an extremely deliberate woman. Every decision she made, especially in these final months, was carefully considered. Nothing was accidental." His words carried weight I couldn't quite interpret, but his slight smile suggested he knew exactly what was coming at Monday's reading. When I mentioned that Evelyn had been calling his office repeatedly, his expression grew even more amused. "Yes, she's been quite persistent in her inquiries," he said diplomatically. "My secretary mentioned she seems very confident about the outcome." Monday morning arrived with unseasonable October heat that made everyone irritable before we'd even gathered in Mill's cramped conference room. The entire extended Blackwood family had assembled. David's cousins from Atlanta and Richmond, elderly relatives I'd met only at weddings and funerals, and several of Margaret's neighbors who'd received mysterious invitations to attend. Evelyn positioned herself prominently in the front row, wearing that emerald necklace like a crown of victory. She'd chosen a navy blue dress that complemented the stones perfectly, and she kept checking her reflection in her phone's camera, probably imagining how she'd look in newspaper photos when her substantial inheritance was announced. "I believe Margaret would want her closest family members to witness this moment," she announced to the room, as if she were accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award rather than attending a legal proceeding. Her smile was radiant, her posture regal, her confidence absolutely unshakable. I sat quietly in the back corner, clutching the velvet pouch Margaret had given me, my heart pounding with equal measures of anticipation and dread. Around me, family members whispered about Margaret's rumored wealth, the value of her antiques, and Evelyn's obvious excitement about her inheritance. As Attorney Mills shuffled through official documents and prepared to begin reading, Evelyn practically vibrated with excitement. She whispered to Emma about finally having the resources to make necessary changes in the family dynamic, shooting meaningful glances in my direction. When Mills asked if everyone was present, Evelyn counted heads like a general surveying her troops before a decisive battle. The stage was perfectly set for what Evelyn believed would be her moment of ultimate triumph. She had no idea that in approximately 60 seconds her entire world would collapse into paste and glass shards, and that the woman she'd spent 12 years trying to destroy was about to inherit everything she'd ever wanted. Attorney Mills cleared his throat and began reading in his measured, professional voice. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning struggling against the October heat and the rustle of legal papers. The last will and testament of Margaret Elizabeth Blackwood, being of sound mind and body. He began, his words carrying the weight of finality that comes with such formal proceedings. Evelyn leaned forward in her chair, her emerald necklace catching the harsh fluorescent lighting as she positioned herself to hear every word. Her smile was serene, confident, the expression of someone who'd never doubted the outcome of this moment. Mills continued through the standard legal language, occasionally glancing up at the assembled family members. When he reached the main provisions, his voice took on a different quality, still professional, but with an undertone that made me sit straighter in my back row chair. To my beloved niece Evelyn, he read, and I watched her grip the arms of her chair in anticipation. I leave my mother's china service and the family photographs, with hopes that she will remember the importance of genuine love over inherited obligation. The pause that followed stretched like taffy. Evelyn's smile faltered slightly, confusion creeping across her perfectly made-up features. That was it. China and photographs? Where was the house, the money, the jewelry she'd been counting on for decades? Mills adjusted his glasses and continued. To my dear friend Mrs. Henley, who brought me soup and checked on my well-being when family could not, I leave the sum of $50,000. Murmurs rippled through the room. Mrs. Henley, who'd been quietly crying in the back corner, gasped audibly. Evelyn's head snapped around to stare at the elderly neighbor, her face registering shock that quickly transformed into something darker. To the nurses at Charleston General Hospital who made my final months bearable with their kindness, I leave $100,000 to be distributed equally among the staff of the oncology ward. The murmurs grew louder. Family members who'd expected substantial bequests began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. David's cousin Paul looked genuinely confused, while Emma's face had gone pale. And finally, Mills said, his voice cutting through the growing tension like a surgeon's scalpel, to Sarah Blackwood, the daughter I never had but always treasured, I leave my entire remaining estate including all properties, financial assets and personal belongings. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Evelyn's face transformed in slow motion, triumph melting into confusion, confusion hardening into disbelief, disbelief exploding into rage. The color drained from her cheeks, then flooded back in angry red blotches. There must be some mistake, she stammered, her voice cracking like thin ice. That's impossible. I'm her only family. I'm her blood relative. But Mills wasn't finished reading. Margaret's voice seemed to echo through his words. Sarah showed me the love and care that blood relatives could not. While others were too busy with social obligations, she fed me, bathed me and held my hand through pain. She gave me dignity in my final months and asked for nothing in return except the privilege of making my days easier. David's jaw had dropped so far I worried it might unhinge completely. His cousins began murmuring among themselves, shooting glances between me and Evelyn like spectators at a tennis match. And Evelyn looked like she'd been struck by lightning, her entire worldview crumbling in real time. What happened next will be discussed in Charleston social circles for decades to come. Evelyn erupted like Mount Vesuvius, her carefully maintained composure shattering into a million pieces. She launched herself from her chair with such force it toppled backward, hitting the wall with a crash that made several elderly relatives jump. This is impossible, she screamed, lunging toward Mill's desk with her hands clawed like talons. That woman has no right. She's not even family. She's nobody. Nothing. Her perfectly styled hair came undone as she gestured wildly, pins scattering across the conference room floor. Mascara began streaming down her cheeks in black rivulets as she alternated between fury and desperate pleading. Margaret was confused, she shrieked. Sick. She didn't know what she was doing. This will is invalid. I'll contest it. I'll fight this. The family watched in horrified fascination as their dignified matriarch transformed into something unrecognizable. David rose from his chair, reaching toward his mother with uncertain hands. "Mother, please calm down. Don't touch me," she snarled, spinning away from him. "This is your fault. You let this happen. You let that nobody worm her way into our family." While chaos swirled around me, I stood slowly and walked to the front of the room with deliberate calm. My hands were surprisingly steady as I approached Evelyn, who was still ranting about lawsuits and family rights and the injustice of it all. "I think this belongs to the estate now," I said quietly, reaching for the emerald necklace around her throat. She clutched it protectively, her fingers wrapping around the stones like they were life preservers. "You can't have it. This is mine. 3 generations of Blackwood women." But shock had weakened her grip, and the necklace slid into my hands with surprising ease. It was heavier than I'd expected, the metal warm from her skin, the paste gems catching the harsh fluorescent light and throwing tiny rainbows across the white conference room walls. I held it up so everyone could see, turning it slowly like a jeweler examining a precious piece. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I asked the room, my voice carrying just enough emphasis to make several people lean forward with curiosity. Margaret always said it represented the true heart of this family. What I did next will haunt Evelyn's nightmares for the rest of her life. With deliberate care, I examined the necklace's clasp, finding the exact weak point Margaret had described during one of our late-night conversations when pain had kept her awake and memories had spilled out like water from a broken dam. The metal was cheap brass beneath its gold plating, designed to look expensive from a distance but never intended to withstand close examination or stress. Margaret had warned me about this, how the jeweler who'd created the replica had cut corners, using inferior materials for a piece that was meant to fool but never to last. With one sharp twist, the chain snapped with a sound like breaking bone. Emeralds scattered across the hardwood floor like green rain, bouncing and rolling in all directions. The sound they made was wrong, too light, too musical. The sound of paste and glass hitting wood instead of precious gems meeting carpet. Evelyn's scream could have shattered every window in downtown Charleston. She dropped to her knees instantly, scrambling to collect the false stones with her manicured fingers, her dignity completely abandoned as she crawled across the floor in her expensive suit. "You destroyed it," she sobbed, her voice raw with anguish. 50 years of family history. You monster. You destroyed everything." But even as she gathered the scattered pieces, everyone in the room could see the truth. These weren't the priceless heirlooms she'd claimed they were. They were costume jewelry, beautiful, expertly crafted, but ultimately worthless paste and glass. As Evelyn knelt among the broken remnants of her delusions, I reached into my purse and withdrew Margaret's velvet pouch. From it, I pulled the documents that would complete her destruction, receipts and certificates that told the real story of the Blackwood emeralds. "These are from 1965, I announced to the stunned, silent room. "The year Margaret sold the real emeralds to pay for her sister Catherine's cancer treatment." I held up the first receipt, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the conference room. "Payment received for emerald and diamond necklace, genuine stones, 18-karat gold setting. Total, $47,300. Proceeds donated to St. Mary's Hospital Cancer Ward." Then I produced the second document, watching as understanding dawned on face after face around the room. "Receipt for replica jewelry creation, paste emeralds, cubic zirconia accents, gold-plated brass setting. Total cost, $250. The silence was deafening as the truth settled over the family like a heavy blanket. For 30 years, Evelyn had been wearing costume jewelry worth less than a decent dinner for two, believing she was displaying priceless family heirlooms while actually showcasing beautiful, worthless glass. The silence in Attorney Mill's conference room stretched until it became unbearable. Evelyn remained on her hands and knees, clutching fragments of paste emeralds while tears mixed with mascara created dark puddles on the polished hardwood floor. Around the room, family members sat frozen in their chairs, processing the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed. David's cousin Paul was the first to move, quietly gathering his coat and briefcase. "I think we should go," he murmured to his wife, who nodded gratefully. Within minutes, the room had emptied except for David, Evelyn, Attorney Mills, and myself. Even Emma had fled, her face pale with shock and embarrassment. By Tuesday morning, the story had spread through Charleston's social circles with the velocity of a summer storm. Mrs. Patterson called me at 7:30, her voice breathless with excitement disguised as concern. "Sarah, dear, is it true about the will reading? And the necklace?" Margaret Sinclair said Evelyn actually crawled on the floor collecting fake jewelry pieces. The phone didn't stop ringing all day. Some calls came from genuine friends expressing support or asking for clarification. Others were clearly fishing for gossip to spread at their next bridge game or charity committee meeting. By Wednesday, I stopped answering unknown numbers entirely. Evelyn's fall from social grace was swift and merciless. The country club, where she'd held court for decades, suddenly became a minefield of whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Her regular bridge partners began citing scheduling conflicts for their weekly games. The Historical Society, where she'd served on the board for 15 years, quietly removed her name from their letterhead and event programs. Even her own sister Margaret called David to express her mortification. "I can't be associated with that kind of public display," she told him, her voice cold with disapproval. What she did at that will reading was beyond embarrassing. It was unhinged. The most telling moment came when David's cousin Emma invited us to her daughter's graduation party but specifically mentioned that Evelyn wouldn't be attending. "I hope you understand," Emma said awkwardly. "After what happened, well, people are talking. And not kindly." David took the news harder than I'd expected. The drive home from the lawyer's office had been silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the occasional sniffle from David as he processed what he'd witnessed. When we finally reached our apartment, he sat heavily on our couch and buried his face in his hands. "Did you know?" he asked, his voice muffled and hollow. "About the will, about Margaret choosing you?" I considered lying, softening the truth to spare his feelings. But we'd reached a moment that demanded complete honesty. "She told me the week before she died," I said quietly. "But David, I had no idea it would be everything. I thought maybe she'd leave me something small, a piece of jewelry or a few $1,000s. I never imagined the house, the money, all of it." He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "And the emeralds? Did you know they were fake? She told me 3 days before she died. She wanted me to understand the truth about your mother's cruelty, about how it had shaped so many lives over the decades." David broke down then, 12 years of willful blindness crashing over him like a dam bursting. He cried for Margaret, who died alone despite being surrounded by family. He cried for me, enduring years of humiliation while he stood silent. But mostly he cried for himself, for the realization that he'd been complicit in his mother's cruelty through his cowardice. "I knew," he whispered through his tears. "Deep down I always knew she was wrong to treat you the way she did. But she's my mother, and I thought if I just kept quiet, it would somehow work itself out." The conversation lasted until dawn, years of unspoken truths finally spilling out between us. David admitted he'd often felt sick watching his mother's Sunday dinner performances but had convinced himself that confronting her would only make things worse. He confessed that part of him had been relieved when I started spending so much time caring for Margaret because it meant fewer opportunities for family conflict. "I'm a coward," he said finally. "I let my mother torment my wife for 12 years because it was easier than standing up to her." 3 days later, David called his mother. I listened from the kitchen as he struggled to find words for what needed to be said. "Mother, what happened at the will reading was unacceptable," he began, his voice shaking but determined. "Your behavior towards Sarah, both there and over the years, has been cruel and wrong. Until you're ready to apologize to her sincerely, you're not welcome in our home." I heard Evelyn's voice rise to a shriek through the phone speaker, though I couldn't make out specific words. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes before the dial tone buzzed through our apartment. David sat staring at the phone for a long time afterward, tears streaming down his face. "She hung up on me," he said quietly. "My own mother hung up on me." Moving into Margaret's Victorian mansion felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. The house was larger than I'd realized during my caregiving visits, with rooms I'd never seen and closets full of treasures Margaret had never mentioned. But more than its size or grandeur, the house felt peaceful in a way our cramped apartment never had. Maria arrived for our first day of work in the new space and actually gasped when she saw the kitchen. The Victorian-era room had been modernized sometime in the 1980s, with commercial-grade appliances, double ovens and enough counter space to handle events for hundreds of people. "Mrs. Sarah," she whispered, running her hands over the marble countertops, "we can hire 6 more people in here. Maybe 8. We could cater the governor's mansion with this setup." The formal dining room became our tasting area, its long mahogany table perfect for displaying sample menus for potential clients. The sun porch, with its wall of windows overlooking the Ashley River, became my office, a space where I could work on business plans while watching herons fish in the shallows. Within a month, Delicate Dishes had transformed from a struggling small business into Charleston's most sought-after catering company. Word spread about our new capabilities and professional setup. Corporate clients who'd never considered us before began calling for meetings and events. Wedding planners started recommending us to brides whose families had budgets Margaret's kitchen could accommodate. The irony wasn't lost on me that the business Evelyn had tried to destroy was now thriving in the house she'd expected to inherit. Family relationships began healing in Evelyn's absence. David's siblings, freed from walking on eggshells around their mother's judgment, revealed themselves to be genuinely kind people who'd always felt uncomfortable with how I was treated. Emma called first, her voice thick with years of suppressed guilt. "Sarah, I owe you an enormous apology. We all knew what Mom was doing was wrong, but she had this way of making anyone who crossed her pay for it later. I was afraid if I defended you, she'd turn her attention to my kids." Tom and his wife Sarah came for dinner the following week, bringing flowers and a bottle of wine along with their own confessions. "I stopped bringing my family to Sunday dinners 2 years ago," Tom admitted. "My wife refused to come anymore after watching how Mom treated you. She said it made her physically sick." Even David's cousins began reaching out, sharing their own stories of Evelyn's manipulation and expressing relief that someone had finally stood up to her reign of terror. Paul called from Virginia to apologize for years of silent complicity, while Emma's daughter thanked me for finally showing Grandma Evelyn that being mean has consequences. Perhaps most surprisingly, several of Evelyn's former friends contacted me privately. Mrs. Henderson from the country club sent a handwritten note apologizing for canceling her daughter's bridal shower and explaining that Evelyn had threatened to make life difficult for anyone who used my catering services. Margaret Sinclair called to share her own stories of Evelyn's cruelty over the years, expressing admiration for how I'd maintained my dignity through it all. 6 months after Margaret's death, I hosted my first Thanksgiving dinner in what was now my home. 23 people gathered around the extended mahogany table, David's siblings and their families, Maria and her daughters, several neighbors who'd become friends, and 3 elderly clients who'd grown dear to me over the months. As I carved the turkey with Margaret's grandmother's silver carving set, I looked around the table at faces full of warmth and genuine affection. These weren't people who tolerated me out of obligation or suffered my presence for appearance's sake. They were here because they wanted to be, because we'd built relationships based on mutual respect and care. The paste emeralds were long gone, swept up and thrown away the day after the will reading. But what I had now was infinitely more valuable, a real family earned through kindness, a thriving business built on talent and determination, and the profound satisfaction of knowing that love and patience had ultimately triumphed over cruelty and entitlement. Margaret had left me more than money and property. She'd left me validation, justice, and the tools to build the life I'd always deserved but never dared to dream possible. If this story of sweet revenge had you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Sarah snapped that emerald necklace and revealed 30 years of fake jewelry. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.